This solves the problems of how we get more variable renewable energy onto the grid. This solves the problem of how we accelerate the build-up. It solves the problem of how we counterbalance the intermittency of renewable generation. It solves the problem of how we mitigate a lot of the world's methane from landfills that otherwise wouldn't be mitigated, and Bitcoin could become, quite feasibly in the next 4 years, the first carbon negative network in the world because it's abating more emissions than it creates.
Welcome back, everyone, to episode 6 of The Signal. This week, Mike and I are excited to have a special guest with us to discuss Bitcoin, energy, the environment, ESG investing, and much more. So, Daniel Batten, welcome to The Signal. It's great to have you on.
Thanks, great to be here.
Yeah, welcome, Daniel. Super excited to have you this week. First guest of The Signal, and we are going to be going into a really deep, interesting topic. This is something that has been top of mind for me for many years, and it's really this intersection of Bitcoin and energy. And there's quite a bit of noise in crypto, and there's quite a bit of noise, I think, around this topic in particular. So really excited to kind of go through some of these topics around Bitcoin's energy use and sort of how you came into the space as an ESG investor. So would love to hear sort of that background story, if you don't mind sharing a little bit about yourself and kind of how you found yourself in this space as an ESG investor.
Absolutely. While I was running a ClimateTech fund at the time, I've set up 2 different ClimateTech funds. And after a little while, I asked myself a dangerous question, which was, are we really having that much impact as a fund? I knew we were getting a good return on investment for our wholesale investors, but are we really making a difference in terms of the climate mandate that we stated that we cared about? And the answer was no. And there were 3 reasons for that. Number one, we were investing in high-risk technologies, which meant that even if they were great, there was statistically only a 20% probability that they would see the light of day. Second issue was that all these technologies were going to have an impact after 2030, which from a climate point of view, that's a little bit too late. And the third issue is that the United Nations is telling us that our strongest lever to reduce climate change in the next 25 years is reducing methane emissions, and it augments our CO2 reduction plan. And we were doing nothing in that space. So I had this moment when I thought, what if we were to completely flip what we were doing, invest in existing technologies that were underutilized, number one. Number two, exist in technologies that could have a pre-2030 impact. And then number 3, invest in technologies that could mitigate methane emissions. So we started to do a hunt around the world and started some research around, well, where is methane that's produced by humans and how do we mitigate it? And we reached the same conclusions that anyone does who starts asking that question, that it's in 3 big places: agriculture, the oil and gas sector, and waste, landfills, sanitation, etc. And we looked at agriculture and we said, well, there's a lot of methane emissions there, but it's not straightforward using existing technology to mitigate it. We looked at oil and gas, and again, there was some work we could do, but we found that there was another area, which is our 3rd largest source of anthropogenic methane emissions, which is landfills, where very little was being done. And we saw tremendous potential to use what's called landfill gas to energy power generation projects to start to capture that methane, because the issue is not that there aren't technologies that can destroy that methane. The issue is that there was nothing around that could do it in a profitable way consistently across a number of the world's landfills. So we realized that the best thing to do with landfill gas methane is that methane is a hydrocarbon, and like all hydrocarbons, you can burn it and you can use it as a fuel source. And when you burn it, of course, it creates CO2 emissions. You might think, well, that's bad, but actually it's net positive, because the alternative is that methane goes directly into the atmosphere, and methane over a 20-year period is 84 times more warming than carbon dioxide. So it's critically important that any methane that's going straight into the air, we stop that urgently. And everyone in the climate movement is united upon this, and the method of using it to generate power has been established for a long time. The issue is that when you turn it into a power, you've got to do something with that power. Generally speaking, you've got to sell it to the grid. And of course, landfills they are never in the right place. They are always remote. And even if they have a grid interconnection, then the grid would often need a major substation upgrade of around $20 million plus to be able to handle those extra electrons coming onto the grid. So for half the world's landfills, there really was no good solution, no economic incentive to destroy those methane emissions that come out of landfills as organic matter rots without the presence of air. So we realized, well, what we really need is a customer for that electricity, which is co-located on the landfill. We started to ask, well, who could that be? Now, it's got to be a pretty unique type of customer. You're not going to get a retail store opening on a landfill for obvious reasons. You're not going to get a residential accommodation development opening on a landfill for obvious reasons. But you're not even going to get a traditional data center opening on a landfill and using that methane for power, because the amount of cost to extract that methane is significant. So it only makes economic sense if a massive proportion of your operating costs are spent on electricity. And there's only one sort of data center customer in the world for whom that's true, where in fact 80% of your operating costs are electricity, and that's a Bitcoin mining company. So we realized that the solution for this landfill gas methane emission that could make a difference pre-2030, that could use existing technology that could mitigate methane in large quantities, was going to be to deploy Bitcoin mining units on site. And we looked at a number of other ways, and that was the only thing that really penciled out across a number of landfills. At the same time, I had friends in the environmental movement and I had friends in the Bitcoin movement who were telling me completely diametrically opposite things about Bitcoin's environmental utility. On one side, I've been told that it was terrible for the environment, it was harmful. But then I had Bitcoiners who were telling me that it was net positive because it could help to incentivize the renewable build out by making renewable power generation more profitable, which could be reinvested into more renewable power generation. And so being an investor, I was skeptical of both claims and I put them both to one side and I embarked on my own research. And what I discovered was that categorically, Bitcoin could be net positive for the environment. In the investment world, we have this thing called the J-curve, which means that you understand that for a period of time you invest in a technology and you're sinking money in the not just belief, but the due diligence evidence that it can reverse that and go up and start making money. And you just got to constantly make sure it's not just going like that. And in climate tech, very similar, where you invest in a technology, which to start with, if you think about solar, if you think about direct air capture, if you think about wind, any form of climate tech that's ever been invented, we forget is actually negative to the environment to start with. It has to be, because it has a carbon debt to pay off as you're extracting minerals from the ground and shipping them around the world. In the case of solar, you have coal furnaces that have to heat up silicon to 1414 degrees to melt it. And so you invest in those technologies because you do the diligence and it looks as though it is going to at some point turn it around and become net positive to the environment. So that was the lens that I looked at through. It's not enough. You can't just look at a technology and say it's negative for the environment, we should ban it. That's simplistic thinking. And it's Luddite thinking, because if we'd done that with solar, we wouldn't have solar today. If we'd done that with direct air capture, we wouldn't have direct air capture today. So we have a long-term view of it and balance skepticism on one hand with patience on the other, these two seemingly opposite qualities. So a lot of my research came from taking a long-term view of Bitcoin and asking the question, not just what is its footprint today, but where is it trending? Where are its potential use cases? Is there evidence backed up by data that it can be negative? Is there evidence backed up by data that it can be positive? Balancing the two, and then taking a neutral perspective about whether this technology was going to be net positive or net negative to humanity.
Amazing. That's a great intro, I think, for this episode. And you've mentioned a few things in there that I kind of want to double click on, I think, as we go into this episode. Probably the first is, I know you have described yourself as a bit of a skeptic to this idea that Bitcoin it could be actually good for the environment and help the build out of renewable energy resources. What do you think it is about yourself that allowed you to sort of go down this path? Like, how much time did it take you to really dig into this data and sort of question both sides of the argument to where you actually landed in the middle and you said, hey, this is something I want to invest behind?
Well, I'd like to give you the answer that makes me look good, that says that I'm just one of the really balanced, objective people who... But the reality is I had some good luck. And I had a chance meeting with one of the owners of one of the companies that I'd invested in, who's a dedicated, committed environmentalist, who had created a form of technology which could decarbonize the world's greenhouses, get them off natural gas and supplant that with a carbon neutral way of delivering clean CO2 to greenhouses, which was part of the biogenic life cycle. And we were chatting and I was talking about some of my misgivings about Bitcoin. This was in late 2021. And much to my surprise, he didn't nod his head and say, yes, you're right, this is bad. He said, well, now he's a scientist, just for context. He said, well, I think your approach is unscientific. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, you're only considering, number one side of the ledger. You're only looking at the negative externalities. Have you looked at the positive? And I said, well, no. Are there some? He said, how do you know if you haven't looked? So that gave me pause for consideration. He said, look, if you're going to be scientific, you have to look at both sides of the ledger. You have to look at this objectively. And he said, look, the second thing is just because something sounds to you like greenwash because you've heard other people make claims and you're an environmentalist and so you have your senses highly tuned to greenwash, it could be that it's not. So again, you don't know until you've done the research. So I'd encourage you not to prematurely evaluate this technology one way or the other, but to look into it deeply, do your own research, do it objectively, put your preconceptions, positive and negative, to one side, and then tell me what you find. I couldn't argue with that. The only argument I had was I knew it was going to take a lot of time, and I wasn't sure I had a lot of time, but then I decided that this was something I cared about deeply enough that I wanted to do the research. And to your question, how long did it take? The initial research took around, I remember, 2.5 solid weeks where I did nothing else, probably 80-hour days where I was just living Bitcoin environmental impact research. I was reading everything. I was reading the claims from Justice and the Sierra Club and Alex DeVries, and I was looking at the Cambridge Index, and I was also reading some of the claims from Lancium and from some of the Bitcoin miners and looking at them and trying to not just balance one side and take a midpoint, because that's not scientific either. If you did that with heliocentricity and you read some narratives that the Earth revolves around the sun and then some narrative that the sun revolves around the Earth, you don't just take a midpoint and say as it kind of does at half the time, then half the year it switches over. No, it can be the case that one side's 100% wrong and the other side's 100% right. So you can't just take a midpoint. That's intellectually lazy. So it really forced me to be very rigorous in my approach and to ask the questions, where is the data to support each side? The conclusion that I came to was that a lot of the claims made against Bitcoin were based on models which were incomplete. They were based on data which was out of date. They had a track record of making predictions which were wildly inaccurate, which had in some cases been debunked in peer-reviewed research. And not that this means we should disregard them, but it is an important point that a lot of the time they came from what I'd call vested interests. In other words, people who had something to lose because of Bitcoin, i.e. employees of central banks, and Bitcoin disintermediates central banks, or people who had an affiliation with what they would call a competing altcoin, which they would like to gain ascendancy over Bitcoin. Now, you've got to be careful, because just because someone has a conflict of interest doesn't mean their arguments are false, but it does mean that we should be wary and we should spend time to analyze and go, what is the intention behind this? Is it to do good objective research, or is it to malign a technology which poses a threat? And a lot of those arguments against Bitcoin, when looked at in terms of, is the data up to date? Are the models accurate? They fell over. When I looked at the arguments for Bitcoin, the arguments were generally, they had more evidence, but again, the evidence was incomplete. A lot of it was speculative about what could happen in theory, but there wasn't a lot of evidence. So for example, I heard a lot of arguments that Bitcoin could accelerate the renewable transition, but when I asked for evidence of this occurring and evidence of a renewable operator who had used Bitcoin mining in order to become more profitable, and I asked for the data on how much more profitable, and did they put that back into expanding their solar or wind farm, I didn't see a lot of data in that area. However, that doesn't mean that the argument's not true. It could simply mean that we're too early in the technology adoption curve. So after that piece of research, I came out much more balanced in my approach, but also hopeful that Bitcoin could be positive, but it was like there's insubstantial evidence to conclude. So I was looking for more evidence, and that really encouraged me to get even more intellectually curious and get more data and talk to more people to see whether it could fulfill its theoretical potential or not. And long story short, over the last 3 years, a lot of my concerns, if these were theoretical, not actual arguments, have been put to bed, because now in the last 3 years, we have seen a lot of actual evidence of real companies who are using Bitcoin mining plus solar or Bitcoin mining plus wind in order to expand the capacity of that renewable generation. They are absolutely putting that back into more wind, more solar. And often people say, well, couldn't you do that with anything? Couldn't it be any off-grid off-taker? And the answer is, and this is the point I'm very clear on, the answer is no. There's something very unique about the economic setup of Bitcoin. It's not that Bitcoin miners are inherently more environmentally minded. They're not. They're about the same as any other industry, any other consumer of electricity. It's simply that, coincidentally, the economic incentive for Bitcoin miners is to chase the cheapest sort of electricity you can possibly find. Happily today, that is usually, not always, renewable or sustainable based, which means that they will go to out-of-the-way places like deserts where there's solar farms, and they have the ability to co-locate on those solar farms, which almost no one else does. And they have the ability to handle variable energy, which no one else does, not even data centers. Data centers need to have what's called 5 nines availability in many cases, 99.9999% uptime. Whereas Bitcoin mining, you can be down a little bit of the time, and all you miss is a little bit of that time that you're mining Bitcoin. But it's not the end of the world, which means that these Bitcoin mining units are ideally suited to co-locate on these renewable sites, help them become more profitable, give them a base price for their electricity. And I've seen a lot of evidence of that occurring. So I'm very confident this is not greenwash. These are actual cases, and they're only becoming more numerous with time. And that was just one of the benefits. Over time, I've found and cataloged around 5 negative externalities and 21 positive externalities of Bitcoin mining.
Very interesting. We're going to have to double click on those positives and negatives in a minute here. But you mentioned something there that I want to just really kind of double click into, and this is the economic incentives and the idea that there's nothing special about Bitcoin miners and them actually wanting to help the environment. It's actually their business model and the economic incentives of Bitcoin mining that are sort of pushing them towards renewable energy. So this is really the conclusion that I came to when I was studying the sort of economic incentive structure around mining and really kind of the base layer of how Bitcoin works. Is that true? Can we talk a little bit about just the business model of Bitcoin mining and why it's inevitable that they are being pushed towards renewable energy? And then, can we see this in the data in terms of, what is the energy mix of Bitcoin miners out there today? And can we prove it by just looking at the data?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. So the point is not that you will always be driven towards renewable energy. The point is that you will usually be driven towards it. You'll be driven towards the cheapest source of electricity available. Now, in some parts of the world, that may be coal, that may be gas. But in most parts of the world, if you look at the cost curve for solar, the cost curve for wind, it's fairly widely known now that in most jurisdictions of the world, I'd say 80% of the time, the cheapest electricity available will be sustainably based. Now, why is cheap electricity so important to Bitcoin mining companies? Well, it's that statistic again that 80% of your cost is electricity. That is the single biggest variable you have to play with that can determine whether you survive or not. And when you have these halving cycles where the amount of reward you get for mining Bitcoin is cut in half every 4 years, there's not an industry on the planet where you basically lose 50% of your income guaranteed every 4 years. That forces you to be hungrier and leaner about what your supply of electricity is. And like I say, this is a historical anomaly. If Bitcoin had been invented 20 years earlier, then the cheapest source of electricity would be fossil fuel, and we'd have a very different equation. We'd be having a very different conversation right now. Happily, it's not. It's renewable, and so those are the sources that Bitcoin mining companies are gravitating towards. When I looked into the data and I looked into the models and I looked into the model exclusions, one of the things I found was the most often quoted model is from the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance. And I was curious about this model because I looked at the model, I looked at the methodology, and I looked at the things that most people don't look at, which is the limitations in the methodology section. And there were two really important things that it said. The first was that they were using a data set which was from January 2022. That was the mining map. And the second was that they excluded what's called off-grid mining. So in other words, these mining companies that were on the grid, like you and I are, when we switch on the power, we're on the grid. We don't go to a solar operator in the middle of the desert and say, can I use your power because it's cheaper? We're not going to go to the hassle. It's not worth it. But a Bitcoin mining company will. And these Bitcoin mining companies are harder to gain the data on because you have to know where they are. You have to do field research. You have to hunt them out miner by miner. You can't just sit in an academic office and create models. You've actually got to do real work and field research to find them out. So I was sufficiently curious that I decided to do that work. And over the course of 9 months found, I wouldn't say all, but a lot of the off-grid Bitcoin mining that was happening in the world. Now, again, remember why you'd go off-grid. The reason you go off-grid is that you're paying too much for electricity on-grid and you think you can get a cheaper price by forming a direct relationship with a generator of energy. And this proves to be the case because often that energy might be energy which is stranded and would otherwise be wasted, energy which couldn't be transported easily to the grid. And so when you're negotiating with people who have stranded energy, then their alternative is they have to waste it, which means they'd be happy to get very low prices for power because there's no other user who can use that electricity. So more and more Bitcoin mining companies have been gravitating towards these sorts of relationships directly with the generator of electricity. 30% of all Bitcoin mining companies today, at least, form these direct relationships for the reasons I've said, because they're going to get, in most cases, cheaper power. Now, remember that 80% of the time they'll be using renewable or sustainably sourced. So you now have 30% of the entire network is using power, which is 80% sustainably sourced. If you exclude that group from your model, you're going to get a very skewed model. When you add them in, suddenly you get a very different picture. And when I added this group of mining companies into the model, then very clearly we could see that Bitcoin mining was not mainly powered by fossil fuel. It was mainly powered by falling water, by hydro, by sustainable energy sources, so zero emission. So in that category, I'd include hydro, I'd include methane mitigation, we include wind, solar, and nuclear, things which are non-emission generating at the point of generation. Of course, you can get into the argument, you can say, well, all those actually do have emissions because you have to create the power stations, etc. That's true. But that's using a standard definition of sustainable energy, which means zero emissions at the point of generation. So today, the estimate is that we have 55% of the power for Bitcoin mining is coming from sustainable sources. Now, the second issue with the Cambridge model was it was using a data set, as I said, which was based on January 2022. The world was very different in January 2022. We just had the China exodus. There were a lot of Bitcoin mining companies still located in Kazakhstan, 13% of global hash rate, in fact, and that's a predominantly fossil fuel-based country. Since then, they have almost all migrated from Kazakhstan. They've gone to places like Paraguay to mine hydro, Ethiopia, hydro. They've gone to the US and predominantly to Texas, which is a balance of a lot of natural gas, almost no coal or hydro, a lot of wind, a lot of solar, increasing rapidly every year. And when you factor in that movement again, you've got a very different model from that older data set. So most of the research that's done, there was a research paper by UN University just last year, and it was using old data from 3 years ago, and it was not factoring on off-grid mining. So that's a reason that you get these marked differences in the models. And my philosophy was we have to build on the existing models we have. No model is perfect, but we have to build on these assumptions because it's not enough and not good enough to say, hey, we're not going to factor in these miners because they're hard to access. It'd be a little bit like me saying, I'm going to take a political poll and predict who's going to win the election, but it's much easier to survey urban voters. So I'm only going to take a sample of urban voters and I'm going to ignore the 30% of rural voters, and I'm going to base my poll on that data. Well, you said it may be easier for me, but you're going to get a very skewed result because we know that whether you're urban or rural will have an influence on whether you vote Liberal or Conservative. Similarly, if I say, well, it's hard to gain the data today, so I'm going to base my polling results on how people felt in January 2022, again, I'm going to be wildly inaccurate, and political opinions are changing about the same rate that Bitcoin power source has changed. It's a very dynamic system. So you have to have contemporary data, and you have to have holistic data, the entire system, in order to be able to say anything sensible at all. One more point I want to make, and that is that I've been in touch directly with Alex Neumuller, who's the head of digital assets at the Cambridge Centre for Alternative Finance. He's well aware of these model limitations. He has been apologetic that it's taken them so long to update them, and they're working really hard to get them up to date. They continue to put more caveats on their model all the time. But this is something known to the Cambridge Centre of Alternative Finance as well, and that's a really important point. It's widely known within the people who are close to the data that the models we have had and have relied on are incomplete and out of date.
Good to know. So I guess what's the best data source? Where should we be going? So Cambridge hasn't updated their models to include the off-grid stuff just yet. Is there anywhere that you would recommend people go to see some of this data? I know the Bitcoin Mining Council, I believe, is also reporting on this. But is there one single data source that you could recommend?
Well, at the risk of being self-promoting, it's my own data source, which has been flipping, which bases itself on the Cambridge model. It has an open methodology about how that data was gathered. The data is all available, open source, so anyone can inquire into it, how it was gathered, what the methodology is, what the limitations were. It gives a breakdown of every single mining company we know about, what their energy mix is, and how we verified what their energy mix is. So that's available on batcoins.com/beast. Bitcoin Emissions and Energy Sustainability Tracker is the name for the model. And that's the model which last year, Bloomberg Intelligence, they looked at the Cambridge model, they looked at my model, and they said, you know what? Cambridge model is out of date. We cannot rely on it anymore. We've actually got to rely on this beast model because that's getting us a more up-to-date and more complete picture of the Bitcoin mining network. And it's important we do because policy decisions are based on these models. So if regulators are deciding to have unfriendly policy towards Bitcoin mining because they believe that it's mostly powered by fossil fuel and that's not accurate, or it's no longer accurate, it was accurate once, that's a bad data source for a decision, and regulators have to have good data to make decisions on.
That's great. We'll put that link in the show notes for this episode as well. So you mentioned your conclusion is that we're at about 55% or so of renewable energy. To put that into context, do we have any comps in terms of other industries? I feel like it's really almost easy, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit about just how easy it is to actually measure this for an industry like Bitcoin mining versus how do you measure this for the finance industry or, the military or whatever. I'm curious, how would you sort of comp that 55% to other major industries out there?
So we do have some data on this. I did a comparative chart a few months ago, and I'm just going to pull it up here. I can give you this and put on the show notes as well. Okay, so right now, banking sector, 39% using sustainable energy. Industrial sector, 32%. Gold industry, 13%. Steel and iron industry, just under 10%. The agriculture sector, 1.6% sustainable energy. Bitcoin at the time was 52.6%. It's since shot up. That was in September last year. So to put that in context, there was a point in time, so we go back to March 2021, the banking sector was using more sustainable energy than Bitcoin. Banking was number one, Bitcoin's number two. But then from August onwards, that was after the migration of hash rate from China and all those coal stations went offline and more renewable energy came online. That's where Bitcoin overtook the banking sector. It hit 50% around a year and a quarter ago, and it's been tracking upwards ever since.
So is it your conclusion that this is the most ESG-friendly asset class or environmentally friendly asset class that's investable out there today?
It is, but not based on that data, because you could still level the criticism. If I was going to say to an ESG investment committee or a regulator, hey, Bitcoin's the greatest ESG asset because it uses mostly sustainable energy, they'd say two things. They'd say, number one, well, who cares? Is it doing anything useful? It's still using 45% fossil fuel. And what does it do that's useful for humanity? They'd say that. And number two, they'd probably say, well, how do we know that it's not taking that renewable energy off other people who could be using it, who are doing better things? So those will be the two criticisms you'll get back. So it's important to establish a baseline, but it doesn't prove that it's a great ESG asset by itself. All it proves is that some of the old data is out of date, and we've been falsely maligning Bitcoin for something we shouldn't falsely malign it for, and that's for predominantly using fossil fuel.
Got it. That makes sense. So I want to maybe transition this a little bit to FUD that we see out in the market. I think we tend to see more FUD when we get into a bull market, I think, and where I believe we're in a bull market, and this hopefully will go for a little while here. So I'm expecting to see more news articles coming from mainstream media or potentially academic papers like we saw in the last cycle, making these arguments about, either Bitcoin is using a ton of energy and it's as much as a small country, and, it's emitting fossil fuels, or it's taking energy from somebody else. What are like the number one things that you think are just at a high level, just like totally wrong? And what's the best way to approach this? I see it's pretty combative typically when you see this getting debated, whether it's on Twitter or whether it's on a podcast or what have you. What is your approach here? Because you're right at the intersection of all this. Curious how you're approaching FUD, and how do we approach this in a sense with a lot of sense, I guess.
Well, you answered your own question
Yep.
in your answer, which is you have to do it in a way which is rational and sensible. And
Yeah.
if I'm to read between the lines, patient. This does require a lot of patience. And for me, it's easy because I remember that I was anti-Bitcoin to start with for environmental grounds. So when I hear people go through some of these counter-arguments against Bitcoin, I see myself and say, well, there, but for the grace of God, go I. It was only because I was lucky enough that I met someone who encouraged me to take a different take and not double down on my initial preconceptions that I did the research. And so if I'm not being patient with other people the way that person was patient with me, I'm being hypocritical. So that's super important. Most of the time, people do not go out of their way to say things that are wrong intentionally. But for the most part, there are some people who have. There is some professionally produced misinformation, but most of it is people who have not been exposed to the benefits. So two things are important here. So the point I made before is that people typically say, well, it's taking energy away from other users who can do something better with it, and it doesn't have any inherent use to humanity. So we have to address those two questions, because the reality is that psychologically, we're actually okay with most forms of energy use. So we use all sorts of energy every single day that has way more of a carbon footprint than Bitcoin does, that uses way less sustainable energy than Bitcoin does. We happily drive our EVs from point A to point B, and those EVs, we call them zero emission. They are in terms of their Scope 1 emissions, but they're not zero emission in terms of their Scope 2 emissions, because that electricity came from somewhere. And on the global grid, only 39% of it is sustainably sourced. The other 61% is fossil fuel sourced. So one thing to point out is that Bitcoin is analogous to EVs. It is a fully electrified network, and as such, like EVs, it has no Scope 1 emissions at all. And like EVs, it does have Scope 2 emissions. And if you compare the two, it has fewer Scope 2 emissions per unit of energy than EVs do. So it compares pretty well. At which point people say, yes, but I can do something useful with my EV. I can use it to drive somewhere. I can't do anything useful with Bitcoin. It has no use. And this is where we have to look into, and we have to question that assumption. How do we know that something has no use? How can you say that something has no use unless you've spent time looking into its potential uses earnestly, objectively? Not, I believe it has no uses. Let me do a 5-minute internet search. I didn't find anything there. It proves that's not objective research. That's you looking for evidence to support your existing belief system because it was convenient and it didn't mean you had to go out of your way to either contradict your belief system or do a whole lot of research. Yep. So to do that, we have to look and say, well, what are its potential uses? What are its claimed uses? And that's where very quickly we start to realize that Bitcoin has an incredible story behind it, which has been largely untold in the Western media. Now, there's two things I point out about Bitcoin that are flipping technology completely on its head. The first thing is, as an investor, it's very unusual. In fact, I can't think of another example where a technology was adopted by retail first, by mum and dad investors, by people on the street, but the institutional investors could not invest in it until more than a decade later. Normally, it's the other way around. Every other single technology company I invest in, retail investors get shut out until you have an IPO, and institutional investors have first shot of making a 10x, 100x, 1000x return on investment. So Bitcoin flips that on its head completely. Very unique. But the other way that it flips how we traditionally understand technology on its head is, generally speaking, the West enjoys the utility of a technology first. So take the internet. Rolled out in the West first, then once that's almost reached saturation, then we think about the developing world, Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, etc. Similarly with the cell phone network, rolled out in the West first, then last in Africa. Bitcoin is the other way round. Its fastest user adoption is in Africa. The number one country adopting Bitcoin right now is Nigeria. The reasons they're adopting it is that Bitcoin solves problems that for the most part we don't have in the West. And those problems are, number one, I'm in a country with high or hyperinflation, and if I don't store my wealth in an asset which is sound, I could lose that wealth, that intergenerational wealth or generational wealth. Bitcoin solves that problem. Again, that's not a problem for the most part we have in the West. Number two, I live in an authoritarian regime, and if I want to speak out against some action of the government that I disagree with, and I want to be part of a human rights movement, then there's a high probability that any funds that I receive will be frozen, and I will be surveilled, and the financial system could be weaponized against me, and I could be put in jail because they can be traced, they can be frozen, I can be censored off the network. With Bitcoin, because it's peer-to-peer, there are no intermediaries, and so its dictators hate it. And so most of the world does not live in a Western liberal democracy. They live in some form of autocratic or semi-autocratic regime, and Bitcoin is brilliant for bypassing the draconian policies and autocratic rule and the ability to weaponize the financial system against its people. Bitcoin stops that. Again, that's not a problem we face in the West, so we don't see it. And then the third issue is that a lot of the world, billions of people in fact, are unbanked. Now again, in New Zealand where I'm from, 99% of New Zealand is banked. But what if you don't have access to a bank? That means that you can't safely receive payments. It means you have to receive cash. It means there's a risk of theft. It means that there's no way to store that, to transact it, to easily pay people, to set up a business. So you're really disadvantaged. With Bitcoin, you can be your own bank. So you don't have to have a bank. And you can make payments. You can receive payments instantaneously without middlemen in the middle clipping the ticket. You can receive transactions without some Western Union middleman in the middle taking 20% of a $100 invoice from, or a $100 payment from one country to another. So it's solving real problems for, I would say, hundreds of millions of people. Willie Woo estimates that right now 4.7% of the world's population are using Bitcoin. So we're a little over 350 million, getting up towards 400 million people. My estimate is half of those people at least are using Bitcoins for the reasons I've stated, to avoid hyperinflation, censorship, and to be able to receive payments easily and to make payments without a well-defined banking system. Once you start to tell those stories of Bitcoin's true utility, then people go, oh, okay, this actually sounds really useful to humanity. You're right. Just because I didn't see it in the West doesn't mean it doesn't exist. That's super important. The moment we see its utility, then we don't tend to view it through that same judgmental lens of being wasteful. Now, having said that, that shouldn't be reason enough. We should still make sure that as well as it being useful, it still has utility and it still has value and it still has the ability to pay off its carbon debt. So then we have to look at that. So let's look at this argument that coin takes energy or takes renewable energy away from other users, or that it somehow puts up prices for other users. They're pure myths. They're not backed up by the data at all, but they have been perpetuated. So it's important that we debunk them. Again, the data does not support any of these statements at all. There is peer-reviewed research. If you talk to the grid owners who are agnostic about Bitcoin as an investment, but who see the value of Bitcoin mining, people such as the former grid operator for ERCOT, Brad Jones, he says very clearly, Bitcoin is a non-rival customer for energy. In other words, because of the incentive structure, people don't understand how energy works for the most part. And this is one of the challenges we have. So the way you and I buy electricity, it's pretty much the same cost every month, right? But if you're a wholesale buyer, if you're an industrial user, it's not the same every day. You pay a different rate every single day, depending on supply and demand. You could be paying 1 cent for a unit of electricity, a unit of energy one day. The next it could be 5. The next it could be 100. The next it could be negative. In other words, you are paid to use that electricity because there's too much and you're being incentivized to soak that up. People don't understand that grids can have blackouts, not only when there's not enough generation, but when there's too much and there's not enough people to use it. So once we understand some of these nuances of the grid, Bitcoin mining suddenly starts to make a whole lot more sense. But again, it takes patience to explain to people just a little bit without going into the physics of it, but the simplistics of how a grid operates. Now, because Bitcoin is using electricity and it pays a certain rate, and these wholesale rates are continually going up and down, what do you think they do when wholesale rate goes up beyond a certain point? What are they going to do? Are they going to keep mining? Of course they're not. They're going to switch off. They're going to have their equations. They're going to say, at this price of electricity, we are now losing money to mine Bitcoin. And so we power off. Now, second thing, why do wholesale prices go up? Well, they go up because of supply and demand, because everyone wants that power at the same time. And so the grid operator puts power prices up to disincentivize people to take that power because there's insufficient demand. Well, isn't that convenient? That the very time when there's a whole lot of demand for electricity is exactly the time when Bitcoin miners get off the network. And then conversely, when prices go extremely low, such as in the middle of the day in Australia right now, where there is a whole lot of surplus solar electricity on the grid, and the grid operator is starting to freak out because there's too much power and not enough people to use it, and the grid could brown out or black out. They put prices very low, or in some cases even negative, to incentivize people to use that power so the grid remains stable. And who's going to use that? Bitcoin miners are going to use that. So they power on when prices go low to help stabilize the grid. And they power off when prices are high to stabilize the grid. Now, again, they're not doing it because they're virtuous. They're not doing it because they want to stabilize grids. That's just a natural byproduct of how the economic incentive works. Bitcoin is a non-rival user of electricity. It uses electricity which helps to stabilize the grid. The net effect of this is because it's using electricity and it's providing incentives for more power to get used that otherwise would have been wasted. And that has the effect of lowering prices for residential users, not putting them up.
It's a super complicated and just a really deep topic, I think, to get into. And this is one of the issues. And I think, moving forward, it helps that we have people like Larry Fink out there just saying, almost like repeating some of these tropes out there, and then people just accept it at that point. So I'm curious, do you see this getting better? I have seen the KPMG put out a report, I think maybe last year. I believe Cornell put out an academic paper on this. What are your views on just, is this getting better? I believe you are one of the people that's helping it get better. And it's great that some of them are citing your research now. But how do you see this sort of improving moving forward?
It's absolutely improving. The quality of research has been done.
Yep.
In the last 18 months, there have been 4 independent reports, KPMG, which you mentioned, is one of them, which shows the ESG value of Bitcoin. There have been 6 peer-reviewed scientific publications that have showed the positive environmental externalities of Bitcoin. There has been 12 mainstream media articles that have showed the positive environmental utility of Bitcoin. And there have even been 4 articles in sustainability magazines which have showcased the environmental benefits of Bitcoin. And just last month, for the first time, there was a climate conference where Bitcoin miners were invited to the conference to talk about the environmental benefits of Bitcoin mining. Now, can you imagine that occurring 3 years ago? They would have been booed off stage. That was only made possible because of the shift in the narrative. Now, that shift in the narrative has not reached Main Street yet, and it hasn't reached the ESG investment committees of some of the world's sovereign wealth funds yet. And so as a result, it's like anything. It's Brandolini's law, right? It takes longer to counteract misinformation than to create it, 10 times longer. So we're still living in this world where the cumulative weight of evidence coming out is overwhelming. There's no question. Bitcoin has many social and environmental utilities and is net positive at an ESG level. However, It's going to take a little time for people to catch up with that shift in the narrative, for regulators, for lawmakers, and again, ESG investment committees to see that this is something that they should not only be saying, hey, it's not as bad as we thought. I think that's the booby prize, but saying, you know what, this actually solves a lot of problems. This solves the problems of how we get more variable renewable energy onto the grid. This solves the problem of how we accelerate the build-up. It solves the problem of how we counterbalance the intermittency of renewable generation. It solves the problem of how we mitigate a lot of the world's methane from landfills that otherwise wouldn't be mitigated. And Bitcoin could become, quite feasibly in the next 4 years, the first carbon negative network in the world because it's abating more emissions than it creates. And at the same time, it has tremendous value to humanity. It's just that value will be perceived in the West last and the developing world first. So there's no question that these things are not only starting to be known, but are backed up by some really solid research now. And it's going to take a lot of time because the reality is wherever a disruptive technology comes in, it's misunderstood to start with. Think about computers. When they first came in, a lot of people were against computers. They said it's going to make everyone redundant. They're going to take over our jobs. Well, that didn't happen. In fact, it created more jobs. Then the internet came in. Well, it's going to be no more useful than a fax machine. It's going to fire up more coal stations. It's going to take all the world's energy. Well, that didn't happen. And we go back in history even further when electricity first came into play. People were very anti that. When bicycles first came in, the New York Times published an article saying that bicycles could trigger psychotic episodes. So we have a history as human beings when something which is not fully understood and is not similar to what's gone before is created, invented. It's our tendency to look at that negatively, not positively. And it's not unique to Bitcoin. That's every single disruptive technology that has ever been invented. It follows this rite of passage. And then people start to understand more. They start to get comfortable. They start to get familiar. A lot of those early predictions that it's going to take over all the world's energy start to get debunked by time, because those predictions post-dated, and that time ends and they get proven not to have been true by an order of magnitude. And people start to look more deeply into it and they say, hey, hang on a minute. I think we have prematurely evaluated this technology. Looks like it's actually pretty good. And the same thing is now happening with Bitcoin. No different.
Love it. Yeah, if it wasn't misunderstood, there probably wouldn't be any opportunity here, right?
That may sound funny, but I'm happy that it was misunderstood because that's forced people to do deeper research than otherwise they would have. And it's also forced people to go, well, you know what? It's not a given that it's going to be positive. You could still use Bitcoin in a way which was really negative for the environment. But let's make sure we don't do that. Let's make sure we use it in ways which are positive. And let's make sure that we shine the light on its positive environmental utility to humanity. Because, hey, frankly, if we don't do that, then that's going to risk Bitcoin adoption because a lot of people will not support it. So yes, we need better quality research, but we also need people in the Bitcoin ecosystem doing things which people can get behind, which are going to be great for humanity. And that is happening. So
100%. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about that. So I think, some of the areas where Bitcoin mining can be super useful is kind of, I think there's a few here, and I'd love to get your thoughts on what you're seeing in terms of how the solar industry is using this. I believe it's being used down in West Texas to build out wind energy. We know there's a ton of use cases for hydro. I believe you're pretty close to this use case with landfills and methane removal. I'm curious, where do you see the most low-hanging fruit out there? And is it clear ROI for anybody that's, in these industries to sort of integrate Bitcoin mining into their production?
Best power sources for Bitcoin is hydro because it's renewable. It's baseload energy, which means unlike solar and wind, it's available at a steady rate, reasonably steady. There are seasonal fluctuations, but you can access it all year round. There's a store of energy, so you're not left vulnerable if the sun goes behind a cloud. You might have some evaporation, but it's not going to evaporate all the water in the dam. So hydro has proven a very good source, and that's why it's the major source for Bitcoin mining today. Solar and wind, definitely Bitcoin mining can use that, but it's used in a different way and the economics work differently. The problem with solar and wind is that obviously you only get the sun for certain hours of the day, and the moment you buy your Bitcoin mining rigs, they start to depreciate pretty rapidly. So you're on a hiding to nothing to earn the money back off your capital investment, which should suggest that solar is a bad way to do that because you can only access that electricity for certain hours of the day. So if you're using an intermittent power source such as solar, the way to do it is you use solar when the solar is available because you get a very good price for that electricity. And it absolutely does help that solar operator become more profitable, which helps them to build out that solar farm faster, 100%. You also need a grid interconnection when the sun isn't shining so that you can then connect to the grid and you can use grid electricity the rest of the time. So that's important. So it's unlikely you won't be using solar the whole time, obviously. And the third thing that's important is that Bitcoin mining companies can earn revenue by selling services back to the grid. And this is, again, an area which has been very misunderstood and misreported. When you're a grid operator, you need to have an insurance policy that if suddenly you lose some power generation capacity or suddenly demand spikes because it's a heat wave and everyone goes home at the same time, plugs on the air conditioners on high, and it was an unforeseen heat wave, that you have some sort of reserve. And there's two ways you can do that. Number one is you have power reserve. So you might have what's called a gas peaker plant, which is idling all year round, burning fossil fuels just for those few parts of the year when you need that additional supply of electricity. The alternative is you have existing deals with consumers of energy where you pay them money to curtail their energy usage. And this has existed for decades. It's called demand response, sometimes frequency regulation or load balancing. But what it means is that as a consumer of energy, you can actually earn money by participating in a grid owner's demand response program where you agree to curtail your energy to help stabilize the grid. And the traditional people who do this have been aluminum plants or steel factories because they can switch off their industrial processes and that gives the grid owner a 4-hour window to start to stabilize the grid because now they've had a consumer that's gone offline. The problem is it's pretty brute force. If you're a steel factory and you suddenly switch off your operation, well, firstly, you don't suddenly switch it off. It's going to take half an hour to go through a sequence of processes. That would be too long for a grid operator. The second thing is that it only gives you a window of 4 hours because steel starts to harden after that. So if you have a heat wave which lasts more than 4 hours or peak energy usage for more than 4 hours, that's not enough. And the third issue is that it's either on or off. So you might have too much demand, you switched off the steel factory, now you've got not enough demand because it's not precisely calibrated to what the grid owner needs. So what these Bitcoin mining companies have been able to do, they offer three major advantages. Number one, it doesn't take them half an hour to adjust. They can switch off within seconds, switch off power completely. Number two, they can stay switched off for much longer than 4 hours. So if you have a peak weather event that lasts 72 hours, no trouble. Bitcoin mining company will supply that power back to the grid for 72 hours. And the third thing is the grid owner can tell the Bitcoin mining company exactly how much power they want them to curtail so they don't overbalance and create the opposite issue for the grid owner. So it's highly modular, it's instantaneous, and it's long-lasting. And so these Bitcoin mining companies have been able to earn revenue through selling power back to the grid. Now, again, if you're a mainstream media operator, this is a wonderful opportunity for you for misreporting. And the headline becomes, Bitcoin mining companies get paid to switch off energy, right? And that's a hit piece. It's irresponsible. It's lying by omission. And it's inaccurate because these Bitcoin mining companies are providing a tremendously valuable service to help stabilize the grid, and they're doing it better than any other consumer of energy has ever been able to do before. And as for them being paid, now remember, there weren't Bitcoin mining companies around. The grid owner would still pay someone to do it. They just wouldn't get such a good service back in response. Plus, they wouldn't have so many people competing to offer demand response services. So when you have more people competing to offer the same service, again, supply and demand economics says that the price of demand response goes down. So by Bitcoin mining companies participating in these demand response programs, they make the cost of demand response cheaper to the grid operators. That cost benefit goes back to residential users. They offer superior ways to stabilize the grid, and it's a natural synergy because these grid operators have never had that same flexibility. And what it means is they're also able to consider obviating the need for gas peaker plants. So in other words, if you have such incredible flexibility in your consumers, you don't need that gas peaker plant idling fossil fuel all year round. You don't need to buy another $1 billion gas peaker plant from Hathaway Energy, which puts more fossil fuel on the grid And currently this is happening. Every time you put more solar and wind on the grid, you also have to put more gas peaker plants on the grid to counterbalance as an insurance policy against the intermittency of these intermittent renewable power sources. So Bitcoin mining acts as an alternative to that. It's truly extraordinary. But again, if your intention is you want to hit peace and you want to malign a technology and you want to create more outrage, well, that nuance gets lost.
Super interesting. So I guess, I'm curious, like, how do you see this moving forward? Should we expect like some of these really large energy producers to start getting involved? I believe like ExxonMobil is getting involved with some Bitcoin mining. Where do you see this how do you see this playing out, I guess, over like a 10-year time frame? Like, are nation states going to start mining Bitcoin? I believe a few currently are. But I'd love to sort of get your idea of sort of where this is all going and how you see it playing out.
There are more nation states mining Bitcoin today than there are nation states who have adopted Bitcoin as legal tender. So Ethiopia, Bhutan, Paraguay, potentially, we're not sure. Certainly they're making a lot of power available to Bitcoin mining countries rather in the Middle East as well. We're seeing a lot of nation state mining of Bitcoin now because it makes so much sense, and they all have surplus energy which they couldn't otherwise use. So it makes sense, rather than send that energy into the ground, to do something productive with it. And Bitcoin mining has been a great example. Definitely I see more of that in the future. And to your question about where I see the industry going, convergence. We're seeing a natural convergence between energy companies and Bitcoin mining companies, where it makes sense that if you're producing energy, then you also have Bitcoin mining available. Why? Because you might not get paid anything for your energy at some points, or you might be paid a negative price. In other words, you're penalized for putting energy into the grid. Now, in those cases, why would you not have some Bitcoin mining units on site so that you could earn Bitcoin by using electricity that otherwise would have been wasted, or otherwise you would have been penalized by sending into the grid? So there's a natural convergence there. Secondly, if you've got a stranded energy asset, so for example, if you're a landfill owner, or if you're a farm, or if you're an oil field and you've hit oil, but you've also hit natural gas, and it's going to cost a lot of money to destroy that methane, well, rather than destroy it at huge cost using a flare stack, you could mine Bitcoin with it. So you're mitigating your environmental footprint. It's a lot better for the environment than flaring, because flaring doesn't fully burn the methane, which, remember, is 84 times more warming over a 20-year period. If you're a landfill owner, again, rather than pay $1 million for a flare stack for each one, and then $100,000 per year to maintain that flare stack, and all you're doing is you're paying to waste an asset, well, why wouldn't you stick some Bitcoin mining rigs on there, some generators, capture that gas, send it to the generators, and generate Bitcoin with it? And if you don't want to do it yourself, then form a collaboration with a Bitcoin mining company who comes in there, where the landfill owner wins because suddenly they're getting paid money for something that otherwise was an environmental hazard plus a health hazard. Because what many people don't realize is that there's 1 million premature deaths caused every year by chronic exposure to atmospheric methane. So it's solving an environmental problem, a health problem, but also an economic problem where an asset is being wasted. It's a fuel source, should be monetized, but it's actually causing health issues and environmental issues at the same time.
And that's maybe as we start to sort of wrap up this discussion a little bit. You mentioned, I think, 350 million Bitcoin users out there currently. I think one of the fears and some of the FUD that we see is, well, what happens if Bitcoin actually becomes the reserve currency? Have you sort of mapped that out? Let's say we go from 350 to 2 billion users or so over the next 5 to 10 years. Like, how do you think about that? How does Bitcoin potentially impact the environment in that scenario?
I'm not concerned about that at all. In fact, that's a very positive thing. The reason I'm not concerned is that over the last 4 years, Bitcoin's emissions as a network have not increased. So even though the amount of energy use has increased significantly, because machines have got more efficient and because more of that energy is coming from sustainable sources, the net emissions is the same today as it was 4 years ago. That's true even though we've seen probably a 5x in price over 4 years, maybe even more than that. We've seen a 5x in hash rate, and we've seen a massive increase in number of users as well. So Bitcoin has already shown that you can have exponential growth in users and hash rate and in energy consumption, but you have not just linear, but static emissions. And the second reason that not only am I not concerned, but I see this as a positive to the environment is the more energy, energy is not the problem. The problem is emissions. Throughout humanity, we have used energy, and energy abundance and prosperity have gone hand in hand. There's no such thing as a nation which has prosperity economically but has low energy usage. It doesn't exist. And so energy usage per se is not the problem, but it becomes a problem when most of that energy comes from fossil fuel sources. Bitcoin is very clearly trending away from that faster than any other industry, and it's already number one, and it's pulling ahead and gaining more distance. But the other reason that the biggest problem with Bitcoin right now is it doesn't use nearly enough energy to be able to fulfill some of its potential. So in other words, the demand response service to the grid, stabilizing grids, allowing more renewable energy to come on, allowing renewable energy operators to become more profitable, being a user for that curtailed energy, being a way to mitigate the emissions on landfills. In order to do some of that really important work for humanity and for the climate and the renewable transition, we need a whole lot more Bitcoin mining to exist. That's the irony. So the more Bitcoin mining is using energy, the better it's going to be for the environment. And a really important point, this is only true because Bitcoin uses a proof of work algorithm. If it used proof of stake, its energy usage would be zero, which would mean it didn't create emissions, but it had no ability to ever become an emission negative network. And as Bitcoin, there are 22 companies right now, so again, this is not theoretical, that are using carbon negative sources. In other words, they're taking methane that would have gone into the atmosphere and caused climate havoc. They're using that as a source of fuel. They're diverting it to a generator and using that to create electricity. And these are cases where if they didn't do that, nothing would have happened. It would have gone straight into the air. And they're doing that without economic incentive, without anyone asking them to, simply because it made economic sense. So the more that starts to happen, and we've already reached 7.5% of the entire network, carbon emissions are offset by this type of mining, and it's increasing year after year. By 2026, it's quite possible that the entire Bitcoin network could become the world's first emission negative network. And if it's not by then, I wouldn't be surprised if it's not far away. So the more energy it's using, again, that's only a problem if those sources of energy are emission creating. If they're emission neutral and emission abating, the more energy usage, the better.
Super interesting, and something to keep an eye on over the next few years. That's 2 years away. That's pretty wild. So maybe, I would love to hear your perspective. If somebody is already a climate tech investor and they are looking to deploy capital into these types of use cases, how would you pitch them? Like maybe they don't really understand Bitcoin or they're skeptical of Bitcoin mining. How would you pitch them that they should sort of get interested and be looking at this space?
I would tell them that only to get interested if they're prepared to do some research, because it is going to take time. Because whenever you're investigating any novel technology, it takes time to understand it. And if you don't have the bandwidth to do that research, I'd say don't get into it. But if you do, if you're curious and if you see that it has real potential, then absolutely do the research. You can short circuit that research by talking to people who've already done it. So you can piggyback on people like me who've done that research already and ask the questions directly. That's a sensible idea. But the more important thing is it's got to fit your investment thesis. So for example, if you're a venture capitalist, investing in Bitcoin mining doesn't make a lot of sense for you because it's not a novel technology. There is, for the most part, no novel IP that you can protect, and you're unlikely to get a 1000x exit. But if you're familiar with infrastructure financing and using existing returns and private equity, then getting into Bitcoin mining, or if you're a sovereign wealth fund, then investing in Bitcoin mining makes a whole lot of sense, particularly because most of these sovereign funds and pension funds will have an ESG committee. And right now they're struggling to find good, solid propositions to invest in, which get good economic returns, but also have provable good returns for people and the planet. And Bitcoin mining ticks both these boxes. So I'd be positioning it less for the venture capitalists, more for the infrastructure investment funds and the sovereign funds and the pension funds. They're the ones who absolutely should be looking both not only at Bitcoin mining, but also direct exposure to Bitcoin.
Stay open-minded, do the research. That's a great way to end this. Well, this has been super, super insightful, Daniel. I really appreciate you coming on. I can't think of a better person to go through this type of episode with. Where can people go to learn more about you and find your work?
They can follow me on Twitter at @DSBatten. And I've also got a company, CH4 Capital, which is doing this infrastructure investment. So ch4capital.com. That's our infrastructure investment fund, which is deploying the money for Bitcoin mining companies to do this landfill gas mitigation.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming on.